Good afternoon. So we stopped at the point where we saw the Angles, the Jutes and Saxons coming to England from the German lowlands. And we saw them settle in England. Okay. So just a flashback. So before they came to England, who were the inhabitants of what we today call England? That island of England. And also the neighboring island of Ireland. They were inhabited by the Celts. I think I mentioned the Celts. The Celts are one sub-branch of the Indo-European family of languages. Excuse me. So I remember telling you that at one time the Celts were very powerful, okay, numerous, so that the Celts existed, lived in a large part of Western Europe, and of course the British Isles, Ireland and England. So the Celts were already living in England and Ireland, and there was a Roman invasion of Britain. That was in the 1st century BCE, and around 54 BCE. In fact, Julius Caesar, the Roman emperor, came to Britain to not to occupy the land. Okay, the Romans had no intention of settling in England. They wanted it to be maintained as a garrison, a fort. Okay, many with soldiers keeping vigil. Romans did not settle in England or even Ireland. I think they didn't even touch Ireland. England was their destination. And the famous saying, came, saw, conquered, vini, vidi, vici. Okay, attributed to Julius Caesar. Came, saw, conquered. He bragged that capturing England was a cakewalk for him. Very easy. Because the Celts were virtually powerless to defend themselves against the Romans. So the Romans captured England very quickly and established their rule. And they built forts to protect their strongholds. They didn't go to the interiors. The interiors continued to be inhabited by Celts. And occasionally there were skirmishes between the Celts and the Romans. But on the whole, the Romans held power in England. But by the middle of the 5th century CE, the Roman Empire became weak. It almost crumbled. So that it did not have the resources to maintain their garrisons in England. So their soldiers withdrew. And the Celts were left behind. But by this time, the Celts had become virtually incompetent as fighting people. Of course, in the 1st century BCE, the Celts in Europe successfully defended themselves against Romans. There is a comic series called Asterix. And in Asterix, you find this history narrated, of course, very humorously. The Celts in France, in Europe, were called Gauls, G-A-U-L-S. Okay. Whereas the Celts in Britain were called Britons. In fact, Britain gets its name from the Celts. Today it is spelled B-R-I-T-A-I-N. The people were called B-R-I-T-O-N, same pronunciation, Britons. So, Britons were the first inhabitants of England. There is another view held by some archaeologists that the Basque people, today found in small pockets in France and Spain, were the original inhabitants of, the first inhabitants of England. But that is yet to be proved. Although the blood of the English people today contains a large segment of Basque genes. We don't know how they mixed with the Basque population. but we don't have archaeological evidence. According to all available evidence, the first inhabitants of England were the Britons. And they had, not just the Britons, they had other Celtic people called Picts, P-I-C-T-S, and Scots. Scots lived in Scotland, what is today Scotland. They were also Celts, and they also spoke a Celtic language. Okay. And the Britons then, later on, one group of them came to be called the Welsh, W-E-L-S-H. And they lived in the western coast, a small part of the western coast of England. You can see the territory in the map. I'll send you the maps later. So the Welsh were finally conquered by the Anglo-Saxons only in the 13th century. Till then, they remained independent. So do you get the picture? In the 1st century BC, 54 BC, the Romans invaded Britain. They held Britain for more than 4 centuries. But by the middle of the 5th century, the Roman Empire collapsed. And the Romans withdrew their legions. Legions are groups of soldiers maintaining vigil over a place. So by the middle of the 5th century AD, they had withdrawn. And the Celts were, in fact, the Britons, not the whole Celts, the Britons were under threat from those two other Celtic tribes, Picts and Scots. And it is said that the Britons sought the help of the Anglo-Saxons, believing that as powerful Germanic tribes, they could drive away the Picts and Scots. They drew away the Picts and Scots, but they also conquered England and settled in England. Okay. Now you get the picture. 3 language families in Britain already. First, the Celtic family. Second, the Latin family, but they did not exert much of an influence because they did not bring their families. They were only soldiers. But there are a large number of Latin words in the English language which came through Celtic languages. Okay, especially terms associated with war, fort, army, so on. Already. Later on, we know many Latin words came from French during the Middle Ages. Right. So, Celtic, Latin, and now Germanic. The German tribes called Germanic tribes called Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, settling down in England and forming 7 kingdoms. You'll learn the names of these kingdoms. These kingdoms, the rule of these kingdoms was together called heptarchy, H-E-P-T-A-R-C-H-Y, heptarchy, the rule of 7 kingdoms. Starting from the north. Northumbria was, I think, the northernmost kingdom. And then finally you have Kent in the north. Many kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, like that. 7 kingdoms. Right. And let us now look at, we are looking at the English language. What kind of language? We must remember that these 7 kingdoms had 7 separate dialects. We call them together as Old English. But we must remember that they did not form a single dialect. There were many dialects. Excuse me. But the most prominent dialect was the Wessex dialect. Most of the Old English literature was written in the Wessex dialect. So we call it the most prominent dialect, spoken in the Wessex kingdom. Okay. Then there was the Northumbrian dialect, Mercian dialect, Kentish dialect, like that. Many dialects. So these dialects together form what we called Old English. So by Old English, we do not mean a single language or a dialect, but a collection of dialects. And we are justified in calling these Old English together because they had some common properties. Now, an important news, an important point to remember is that these people had their own script. They did not use the Roman script, which we are using to write English, till the 7th century, till they had converted to Christianity. They were pagans. They had many gods. Odin, okay, a name of a god. Thor, from which we get the name of the day of the week, Thursday. Thursday is Thor's day. Wednesday is Wodin's, W-O-D-I-N, like that. They had many pagan gods. And they were not Christians. They were converted to Christianity only in the 7th century. But they were a Germanic people who were pagans. And they brought with them from Germany their own script, which is called the runic script, R-U-N-I-C. We don't use the runic script now. But if you look up the International Phonetic Alphabet, I think you have learned phonetics for your BA. And you know there are some symbols which you don't find anywhere. The th, for example, it's called a theta symbol with a rectangular, an oblong circle with a line in the middle, th, and the sound in then, which we write like a J, slightly bent at the top and a line cutting across in the middle. All these are actually runic alphabets, which the International Phonetic Alphabet adopted. But we don't use the runic script now. We've got inscriptions written in the runic script from various parts of England. Archaeologists have unearthed these writings, inscriptions. But this doesn't mean that the Anglo-Saxons continued to use the runic script. They abandoned it in favor of the Roman script, which they adopted from the monks who came with the mission of converting them to Christianity. Right. So even before the English people were converted, the Celts in Ireland had been converted. So they were the first people to be converted to Christianity in the British Isles. Then some priests from Ireland came to England to convert these people. So by the 7th century, nearly all of them had been converted to Christianity. Okay, now we will look at that later. Now we'll look at the language. Old English was a typical Germanic language, almost unmixed with other languages. The mixing comes later in the 11th century with the Norman invasion. But before that, Old English was an almost unmixed, of course, a few words they might have got from the Celtic languages and some from Latin. But otherwise, let us roughly estimate that more than 90% of their vocabulary was pure Germanic. So, Old English was in many senses a typical Germanic language. So what is a typical Germanic language like? What are some of its properties? One property is free word order. Okay. Now, for example, the word order of English is subject, verb, object. Ram killed Ravan. In Malayalam it is Raman Ravanane konnu. Subject, object, verb. But in Malayalam we still have a somewhat free word order. If you say Ravanane Raman konnu, the meaning does not change. Or Ravanane konnu Raman, the meaning doesn't change. So Old English was more or less a free word order language. Why was this so? Why is modern English a strictly word ordered language? Because modern English is not inflected like Old English. What does this mean? An inflection is a particle that is attached to a word. For example, Raman Ravanane konnu, this ne. Such words where such particles existed in Old English. Okay. So, even if you change the word order, the meaning does not change. Whereas in modern English, the function of these particles is done by prepositions. Okay. And sometimes you can dispense with the preposition. You need not say Ravanane. You can just say Ram killed Ravan. The position of the word in the sentence will make clear who is the subject and who the object. So, Germanic languages at that time were highly inflected languages, maintaining a free word order, more or less. Right? That is one important characteristic. And second, Germanic languages in those times were synthetic. What do you mean by synthetic? A synthetic language is one in which you can go on adding words to one word and forming large compounds. Okay. So, Malayalam at one time had this property. Not so many words as Germanic. Okay, for example, you can say something like പറയാതിരുന്നെങ്കിൽ എന്ന് പറയാതെ ഇരുന്നു എങ്കിൽ എന്ന്. Or you can add one more word. പറയാതിരുന്നെങ്കിൽ എന്നല്ല 5. And you can write them together. But the modern tendency is to avoid such long compounds. I'll show you a Germanic compound, modern German compound word. A single word will run into a paragraph. So imagine a sentence like this. The deputy chief of the harbour works of the government of Kerala. Okay. German will write all these together. Deputy Director Harbour Kerala Government Works as one word. So such languages are called synthetic languages. Okay. And the tendency of English after this period is to reduce the size of the compounds. So you have already learned two things. Old English was a synthetic language, like modern German. German has retained many of its properties, the German language, spoken in Germany, Switzerland, Austria. This language has retained some of the features which it had 2000 years ago. It is still a synthetic language, although perhaps the number of the size of the compound, a normal standard compound, has been reduced. 1. 2. It can still have a free word order, although it's not very common. It is highly inflected. I'll explain that. What is meant by being highly inflected? A word is inflected for various purposes. One, for example, to change the status of a word from subject to object. Ravanan, you add a, Ravanane. 2, to indicate the gender of a word. Normally we know that verbs are not gendered today in English. You can say I came, he came, you came, she came, they came. But in Old English, these even verbs were gendered. Okay. Verbs were inflected for not only gender but also person. First person, second person. If you have a plural noun, you have to say a verb little differently. So in Hindi, you still have this inflection for the word. Karta, karti, karte. ये लोग ऐसे करते हैं, मैं ऐसा नहीं करता हूँ, वो ऐसे ही करती है. Masculine, feminine, plural. But that is not the whole story. Even adjectives were inflected. Say, for example, normally you say in Malayalam, Nalla kutti, okay, Cheetha kutti, okay, Veliya veedu, etc. In Old English, even adjectives were inflected. If the subject was male, you had a certain word. If the subject was female, you had another kind of word. This practice still exists in Hindi. You have to say achi, acha, ache, etc. Ache din, what our Prime Minister talked about. Good days, plural. So the plural has to be indicated by adding this a at the end. Ache din. Right? So Old English was a heavily inflected language. And it had what we call grammatical gender. What is the difference between grammatical gender and natural gender? Natural gender is the gender that you have biologically. Okay, you are male, female, or neutral, whatever category you belong to. Grammatical gender is the way words get gendered, like this, achi, if the subject is female, achi ladki. Okay. You even convert some alien words into your own gender system. Okay. So today morning when I was traveling by car, I heard a song on an FM channel. Love story ya, ladki, ladkiya. So an English word, when it was adopted in Hindi, it becomes feminine on the analogy of ladki. So love story, plural, love story ya, ladki, ladkiya. This is called grammatical gender. So Old English was a language with grammatical gender. Grammatically gendered for, inflected for gender. Right. This was one property of the Old English language. Right. So synthetic, highly inflected, grammatically gendered. What else? As I said, it was an unmixed language almost. Purely Germanic. It did not have many non-Germanic words. Okay. Then we also find that Old English was changing. By the end of the 10th century, it was already changing. When the Normans invaded the country. And some of the changes was, one important change was the reduction of irregular verbs. What are irregular verbs? Irregular verbs are verbs whose tense system is a little fuzzy. For example, what is the past tense of cut? Cut. The past participle is also cut. Cut, cut, cut. Put, put, put. Okay. Hit, hit, hit. You can't say hitted. You can't say hitten. So there are some words like, they are called irregular verbs. Okay. There are other types of words, verbs, where the normal system is breached. Okay. Like, for example, in Old English, in German, the Germanic language, the system was for the vowel to change to indicate tense. For example, you have fly. What is the past tense? Flew. Past participle? Flew. So these three-tier system. Okay. You have a three-tier system. But slowly it was being replaced by a two-tier system. Okay. Such as talk, talked, talked. Fly, flew, flown. Swim, swam, swum. So tense was indicated by a vowel change in the middle. This was changing. This was changing so much that by the end of the period, by the end of the 10th century, when English was about to be invaded by an alien people called the Normans, England had already become, the English language was already changing. And we know that in the Old English period, when is the Old English period, by the way? 500 CE to 1100 CE, around. Because the Normans invaded Britain, William the Conqueror came to Britain in 1066, towards the end of the 11th century. So we include these two centuries, 5th and then the 11th. So the period between the 5th to the 11th century is called the Old English period. Right? And we are going to see something very dramatic at the end of the 8th century. What is that? I said that Old English is an unmixed language. Not completely true, by the way. Because by the end of the 8th century, a people called the Vikings, V-I-K-I-N-G, or Scandinavians, they are also called Scandinavians. They are a Germanic people, like the English. Right. So they invaded England. They came through the German lowland, like the Anglo-Saxons. They came in their boats. They invaded England. And they ruled many parts of England for 2 centuries, more than 2 centuries. And they left a large number of words behind them. They just mingled with English people. They did not go back. So English has a large number of Scandinavian words. Okay. Even no is a Scandinavian word. Nitwit, what you call people who have no brains at all. Mandanmar, nitwits. Nitwit is actually a Scandinavian expression. It means, nitwit means I don't know. So when they invaded England and settled down, if you ask them something in English, they'll say nitwit. So this expression came to be used by the original Old English people to refer to first to Scandinavians as fools, and then the expression simply meant somebody who had no wit. The W-I-T in nitwit is actually W-E-E-T, wit. Okay. Nitwit, I don't know. So there are a large number of such words. Sky, scape, all these are Scandinavian words. You'll find a list of knife is a Scandinavian word. So it is true that the Old English contained only Germanic words, but it is mixed with Germanic words from the Vikings were also a Germanic people. So Vikings brought with them their language, which got mixed up with the English language. Okay. So this is the scenario that you get, okay, of the language, its particular nature that you find. What kind of language was Old English? So remember that when I am talking about Old English, I am talking not about a single language or dialect. I am talking about many dialects. I am talking about many dialects which coalesced to form one dialect. Alright? No, okay. Let's go back to the 5th century. You see, when the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes invaded England and settled down in the country. When they came to England, as I said, they were pagans. They worshipped many gods. They worshipped Odin, they worshipped Thor, many pagan gods. So their literature was also pagan. What was the theme of many of their poems? War. War, wandering, seafaring. They were seafaring people. Okay. And they continued to be a seafaring people. Because England, the English were the British, English or the British, were one of the first people to colonize non-European territories like the Spanish and the Portuguese. So this is because of their seafaring tradition, building boats, ships, traveling to all parts of the world. So the Anglo-Saxon literature has many such poems or songs about seafaring, traveling by the sea, adventures in the sea, fighting. They were a ferocious, militant people, we know that. So they wrote songs about war. And of course they wrote songs about love. So there were a number of important poets of the period. Okay. And one very important text is, what is that? Beowulf. Beowulf, containing around 3,000 lines. This is an epic, like Iliad and Odyssey, or like Ramayana and Mahabharata. But it's a small epic. An epic of only 3,000 words. And actually what happened in this, what is described in this epic, did not happen in England. It happened in Scandinavia, where to which the English-speaking people had connections. So the slaying of the monster, the victory of Beowulf, all these happened not in England but in Scandinavia. So the first English epic is set not in England but in Scandinavia. And although the version that we have today was written in the Wessex language, it is believed that it had been translated from another dialect, Mercian or some such dialect. It was not originally written in the Wessex dialect. So Beowulf is one of the important works, probably the most well-read work. Then there are some properties of Anglo-Saxon poetry, such as what are called kennings, K-E-N-N-I-N-G-S. What are kennings? Kennings are compound words, okay, which describe an object in very figurative terms. For example, what would you call a ghost in Old English? A ghost would be called wind walker because he walks in the air. പ്രേതങ്ങൾ അങ്ങനെയല്ലേ സഞ്ചരിക്കുക, നിലം തൊടാണ്ട്. What would you call a ship? Sea Walker. The Wind Walker is actually the name of a Hollywood film featuring a hero who was believed dead. And his children even conducted ceremonies for him. But then when they went on a travel and came back, he was still alive. A very interesting film in which Trevor Howard, the Hollywood actress, took the role of this chief of a Red Indian tribe. Interesting. So these are called kennings. Okay. And the late 19th century poet, Hopkins used these kennings very profusely in his poetry. He loved to use Old English poetic methods. So what did he call an eagle? An eagle was called windover. Windhover, something that hovers in the sky. So an eagle is a bird that hovers in the sky. So Hopkins called it a windover. So these are called kennings. So kennings were very popular in Old English poetry. Okay. And what are called run-on lines. Run-on lines means a line which is extended to the next line actually. Okay. What are also called broken lines. So a sentence does not end in one line, it slips on to the next line. Also a feature of Old English poetry. Okay. So the themes I've already mentioned, what kind of themes were there? But when the country was Christianized, when it was converted to Christianity, it happened that the poetry, the literature also underwent a change. So you have a poem called Song of the Rood. Rood means the cross. It's a poem about Christ on the cross. So there were many such poems. Okay, and one of the important poets was Lyman, Laymon, and his well-known poem is called Brut, B-R-U-T. So most poets, after the conversion of the English, wrote their poems with Christian themes. Okay, sacrifice, martyrdom, all these became the subjects of Old English poetry. But Beowulf remained the most important text for a long time to come. Alright, what else was written? There was a work originally written in Latin by a bishop. There were bishops now. When the church was established, it was established as a hierarchy. I think some of you would know how the Christian church functions. Right at the top is the Pope. And just below the Pope is the Archbishop, who is in charge of a large area called the Archdiocese. Then the Bishop, who is in charge of the diocese. Then the Vicar, who is in charge of a church. So on. മലയാളത്തിൽ പറയില്ലേ അതിരൂപത, രൂപത, ഇടവക. Okay. Parish. Idavaga is called parish, where you have one important church. So there was a scholarly bishop called Bede, B-E-D, and he wrote a book in Latin, The Ecclesiastical History of the English-speaking people. It has been translated into English. It had an Old English translation also. Right. And this was translated into English and became popular. That is the first important scholarly work in Old English. But that is not the only work which is important. You have what are called Anglo-Saxon chronicles. What are they? Anglo-Saxon chronicles are historical records of the reigns of various kings. അവർ ഭരിച്ച കാലത്തിനെ പറ്റിയുള്ള വിവരങ്ങളാണ്. First began by King Alfred. King Alfred is a person who you must remember. He was the one who was able to unite the English people against the Scandinavians. So at one time the Scandinavians had come deep south. All except Wessex had passed into their control. But King Alfred was brave, bold. He stood up to them and finally drove them north. And he made a treaty with them and allowed them to live in an area which was called Danelaw, Danelaw, north of the Humber River. So the Scandinavians continued to live. But after some time their territory was conquered by other English kings. And the Scandinavians finally mingled with the English population. So King Alfred commissioned what came to be called Anglo-Saxon chronicles. And records are still seen in churches. They were maintained at churches. Okay. So it gives you a good idea about the reign of various kings of England in the Old English period. Right. And the Old English people found a great leader in King Alfred. Okay. He was responsible for uniting the English people. So as I told you already, when the English settled in England, they were scattered into 7 kingdoms. And it is Alfred who was principally responsible for uniting them. Scotland, of course, remained outside the kingdom for a long time. Scotland was united with England only in 1707, such a long time after. So till then Scotland was a separate kingdom. But England was united. England was united by King Alfred. Not only that he united England, he established the Wessex dialect. Told you there are many dialects. There were many dialects. Wessex became the most prominent dialect. You can call it the standard dialect of England. And we find later on in the medieval period that it was the area where the Wessex dialect was spoken that also gave another standard dialect to the English language. It is called the East Midland dialect. But that is it much after King Alfred's period. But already in King Alfred's reign, the Wessex dialect was gaining prominence over other dialects. I've told you that already, that the Anglo-Saxon chronicles were composed in the Wessex dialect. The available most popular copy of the epic poem Beowulf is also in the Wessex dialect. And there were some attempts by King Alfred and others to translate the Bible into Old English. Largely unsuccessful. It did not get the permission and encouragement of the church. So it was left off halfway. Okay. So this is the picture that you get. By the 7th century, England had become Christianized. The language was slowly changing. Although, as we will find later, the dramatic changes came with the Norman invasion in the 11th century. Right. So, I think I'm signing off now. So, preparing a video lecture is a very arduous task. You can't speak for more than 30 or 40 minutes. So I have taken something like 45 minutes. But I'll be getting back to you with more interesting videos. So for the time being, bye.